I know my story is a bit long, or at least the context is, but to tell it properly, I need to explain a bit. I've only been to Italy once, and I had the opportunity to visit Venice with my husband's family. We went in December and stayed at the Gritti Palace. It's worth mentioning that December is the rainy season there, and the entire city floods due to the sinking caused by the weight of the buildings. In some places, the water can even reach up to 50 centimeters in height. Because of this, you have to walk on platforms through the streets, and many locals leave for dry and warm places during the Christmas holidays, leaving many houses empty and the streets lonely and dark. Overall, it's a gloomy city with a somewhat strange vibe in many places. I felt odd. There was a sense of oppression, which I believe has to do with the enormous number of deaths that occurred there since the Black Plague. The sick were sent to the island of Poveglia in front of the city. There were many trials during the Inquisition in St. Mark's Square, and with the two great wars, you can imagine how many ghosts might be wandering around. During that trip, I was there for only 3 days, and on the second night, I got up to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night. There were some lights on the floor to avoid tripping, so it wasn't completely dark, but the place wasn't sufficiently illuminated either. When I reached the bathroom, I suddenly saw the silhouette of a woman. She appeared misty, and I couldn't see her clearly, although I could make out that she was wearing a puffy dress, like one from the mid-19th century, but it was deteriorated and very discolored. I felt something from her. It was sadness. However, this frightened me immensely, so I ran back to bed and couldn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I told my husband about it. I'm not sure if he believed me at the time, but the conversation ended there and we went out for a walk. That night was the Christmas Eve dinner. We were in a restaurant, everything was lovely, and I had almost forgotten what I had experienced. Suddenly, my husband got up to go to the bathroom. When he came back, he seemed a bit strange and asked me to join him in the lobby. We stopped in front of a painting, and my husband said, "Could that be the woman you saw?" I swear, when I turned to look at the painting, I nearly fainted. It was the same woman I had seen. I don't know who she was. I can't remember her name, but I suppose she was the owner of that palace. Naturally, I couldn't sleep again that night. To make things worse, around 3 a.m. an alarm started sounding, the air raid siren. Anyone who has seen World War II movies knows what it sounds like. But my husband calmed me down by explaining that it is used nowadays to warn that the tide is rising. Honestly, it was a strange trip. While the city is beautiful, I am quite sensitive to these types of things, so I am pretty sure I would never return to Venice. This happened last year during the end-of-year holidays. My family and I booked a hotel, nothing luxurious, just the essentials: a room, bed, private bathroom. And outside was a pool that we could see from our second-floor rooms where we were staying. My cousins and I were excited to get into the pool, so we headed there almost immediately upon arrival. The next morning, the first thing we did was go swimming again. We saw some small children swimming as well, and at one point, one of them said he touched something under the water. We went over, and one of my cousins reached in and felt something too. The older boy grabbed whatever it was and lifted it a bit, and then we realized it was a drowned person. We quickly got out and alerted our parents. The police arrived and pulled him out. It was a man of about 20 years old. His face was green and blue, and his arms were stiff in an upward position. That image will never leave my mind. Seeing it made me vomit from the shock. We found out he had died because he was under the influence of alcohol and had come from a party. We left that same day and never went back. I have waited for this moment for many years. I work as a maid, room cleaning staff for those who don't know, and since October of last year, when I touched and placed an ojo de vado, which I must clarify, I didn't know at the time what it was or what it was for, several paranormal things have started happening specifically to me and on the floor where I usually work. Once, along with another colleague, we heard someone suddenly knocking on the door. When we looked out, we realized there was no one there. This room, to give you context, was adjacent to a wall on one side, and on the other side, if someone wanted to hide, they would have had to run to the corner where the elevator is, and their footsteps would have been heard in the hallway. So we couldn't find an explanation for what we heard. Moreover, not even 10 seconds had passed since the knocking, so it was evident that the responsible party couldn't have simply hidden or escaped. On another occasion, the handle of a door leading to the service elevator started moving from inside as if someone was trying to open it. At that moment, I thought it might be another colleague with their hands full, so I opened the door and found nothing on the other side. The curious thing is that there's a light with a motion sensor right there, and at that moment it was off, indicating that no one was there. Another day, while cleaning a bathroom in a room, I suddenly heard the air conditioning turn on. This device makes a beep when it's operated, and it was heard repeatedly and very quickly, as if someone were playing with it. But as you can imagine, when I went to check, I found nothing and no one in the room. All these events and more started happening, and I believe it's because I played with that ojo de vado, which they say is meant to trap bad vibes. They say that when I put it on, those vibes transferred to me, causing these kinds of activities to occur more where I am. It's nothing very serious, but it does make us uneasy at times. We even joke that it's due to Xanax or something like that, mostly for laughs. However, sometimes I feel like there's someone behind me, and in those moments I think, don't turn around, for the love of God, don't turn around. By the way, the hotel I work at isn't a rundown motel or anything like that. It's part of a large, family-friendly chain. The building was remodeled after 2019, so it's a recent hotel, and doesn't seem to have a history of murders, rituals, or other things that might leave spirits behind, as someone might think. This happened to my husband and me in 2020 during a vacation in Laughlin, Nevada, at the Tropicana Hotel Casino. We stayed there for 3 nights. On the second night, around 1 a.m., my husband was still awake watching TV when the lamp on his nightstand started flickering and turning on by itself. Seeing this, he took out his phone and began recording. In the video, you can see the lamp flickering and many orbs passing by. As he got closer, you could also hear the sound of electricity. After a few seconds, this stopped and nothing else happened. My husband is not easily affected by these things and doesn't scare easily, so he just continued watching TV calmly. He didn't tell me about it because he didn't want to scare me. However, the next day, we had a somewhat strange experience. We were waiting for the elevator, and when one arrived, it opened its doors very slowly, so slowly that we didn't trust getting in. So, we waited for another one. When we got to the first floor and got off, the other elevator we hadn't wanted to get on also arrived and opened its doors. The weird part was that no one was using it, nor was anyone waiting for it, so it didn't make sense for it to arrive and stop on that floor out of nowhere. At that moment, my husband told me about the lamp, and it all just seemed like a couple of strange anecdotes. However, the last weird experience happened to me in the bathroom when the lights started flickering very strongly. Annoyed, I shouted, "Stop!" And at that moment, all the lights returned to normal. You might think it was some sort of electrical malfunction in the hotel, but before and after that time, we've stayed at that same hotel many times and have never had another similar experience. I was petrified but tried to calm down and reason. I even thought it could be the manager, but then I remembered I couldn't call him. So I stayed there, listening to the knocking, which got louder and more forceful. I decided to ignore it and try to sleep. After a few minutes, whoever was knocking left. I thought maybe I was being paranoid. After all, strange things happen in the capital. I managed to sleep a few hours, and when I woke up, I got ready to leave. When I opened my door, I saw the girl leaning against a wall. I'm not someone who likes eye contact, but on this occasion, for some reason, my gaze met hers. She looked tired and sad. I didn't say a word and continued on my way, somewhat relieved to see that she seemed okay. When I arrived in Coyoacán, I spent a pleasant afternoon with my friends. At one point, they asked me where I had stayed, and when I told them, a guy in the group said, "I think they found a body there today." Skeptical, I searched for the news online, and indeed it was the same hotel. I read the article to find out who it was, and my skin crawled when I saw that the victim was that girl, and that there was a photo of the guy with sunglasses. The article labeled him as the possible murderer. I was in shock because the report said the events occurred in the early morning, which seemed impossible to me since I had seen the girl in the morning. A chill ran down my spine, and I shed some tears. My friends consoled me, and some even scolded me for not calling the police. But I honestly thought they were having an intimate moment, and that calling the police could even get me fined. I told my friends that I had information about what the guy looked like, but they advised me to send it online, as dealing with the police in Mexico could get me into trouble. So I did that when I got home. I tried to contact the authorities, but the person who answered me simply said, "She was a sex worker, the case is closed." This made me feel so powerless and sad that, to this day, I struggle to stay in hotels. Sometimes I think about who knocked on my door, and it horrifies me to think it might have been the guy trying to harm me since I appeared to be the only witness. I have been working as a garbage collector for about 5 years, 2 of which I have spent on the same route, covering the industrial parks of the city. You wouldn't believe the number of strange and quite uncommon objects I've found in the containers, from the materials used by the companies to cell phones, jewelry, toys, and other personal items. However, there was one discovery that I found extremely disturbing. I remember we were about to finish our shift and had collected the waste from all the factories in both parks except for one, the one at the far end of one of them. It was around 8 p.m., and amidst laughter and songs, my colleagues and I approached the large metal containers on the sidewalk of the company. We emptied them, and I finally picked up a couple of bags that were next to the bin where the rest of the trash was. However, these bags were too heavy, so I had to drag them, causing them to tear on the ground and completely burst open, spilling all their contents onto the street. This upset me a lot because now I had to figure out how to pick up all the sawdust that had scattered on the asphalt. I asked my colleagues for help, and they brought over some cardboard boxes that we had just thrown into the truck and began filling them with the spilled waste. We were in the middle of the task when I picked up a pile of sawdust and an object fell to the ground. When my colleagues and I looked at it, they let out a scream mixed with a bit of fear. It was a completely severed human finger, with part of the bone exposed and a very dark coloration. At first, we were all at a loss as to what to do since we had never encountered something like this before. After a moment, we decided to call the authorities, as it was the most sensible thing to do. Surprisingly, they arrived very quickly and began asking questions. They contacted the company managers, who also arrived promptly to see what was going on. In the end, it turned out that a few days earlier, a worker had had an accident in which a saw had completely cut off his finger. Everyone had searched everywhere for this finger to try to reattach it, but no one realized that it was already mixed in with the sawdust that was going to be discarded from the company. Unfortunately, and as expected, the finger could no longer be recovered. Sometimes people throw away things in good condition, and it's common for someone to take them if they want. Clothes, shoes, electronic devices. It's really surprising what some people throw away. But a few years ago, I decided to take one of these items, and it's something I regret to this day. It was a doll, a small, rather cute yellow rabbit. It was in perfect condition, so I found it very strange that it had been thrown away. I knew a little about the people in that house. The gentleman was very kind, and sometimes came out to give us a tip and have a quick conversation. Anyway, my original idea was to wash that doll and give it to my daughter, who was 3 years old at the time. But on second thought, I believed it wouldn't be a good idea since it was in the trash. And you never know what kind of diseases it might have. Maybe something that soap couldn't remove. So in the end, I decided to place it as an ornament at the front of the garbage truck. I'm not superstitious or anything like that. I never have been. But I would be very stubborn to deny that there was something strange about that doll, and many of us noticed it. Some colleagues, especially the driver, said they heard strange noises like voices or whispers coming from the front of the truck. Several times I myself saw that doll move in a strange way or change position. Finally, I decided to get rid of it because although nothing drastic had happened, we all felt very weird about it. So one day, I left it in the dumpster and never saw it again. The curious thing is that as soon as I got rid of it, the strange things and the heavy vibe disappeared immediately. All those things made me think about the reason why they had originally thrown it away. So, out of mere curiosity, as soon as I had the chance, I asked the owner of the house where I had found it. "Did you throw away a small yellow stuffed rabbit, right?" I asked him. Of course, that question seemed quite strange to him, but even so, he simply answered yes. Afraid of being even more intrusive, but with my curiosity gnawing at me, I asked why he had thrown it away if it was so pretty. The man smiled slightly, probably because of how odd the question was, but immediately afterward he replied, "My son kept saying that the doll wouldn't let him sleep at night and that it talked to him, so my wife made me throw it away even though it was almost new." At that moment, I understood that all that discomfort and that strange, malevolent presence we had felt was not our imagination, much less a coincidence. I don't know what was really going on with that rabbit, but it definitely wasn't just a simple stuffed toy. Some time ago, my neighbor, who works as a garbage collector or recollector, as we say in Argentina, told me that a few years back, while collecting bags, he found a very large, heavy black bag. The bag had a label that said, "Good clothes." Sometimes people do this. They throw away things that might be useful to someone else. So my neighbor didn't hesitate and opened it. The first thing he noticed was a horrible smell. It was wet. He told his co-workers, and they went to check it out. In the darkness, they hadn't realized that the wetness was blood. All the clothes were children's sizes for boys and girls, and they were all covered in blood. They called the supervisor and immediately the police. There was an investigation, and he was called to testify a couple of times, but he never found out what happened. He told me that after that, he had to take a leave of absence because he was so traumatized and he never understood why the note said "good clothes." He broke down as he said who would be such an expletive to do something like that. He never went back to that route. This didn't happen to me, but to my father. At that time, he was working as a garbage collector. He was with a church member, discussing how the world was created. My father is the kind of person who likes to annoy people, so he started questioning how someone we don't even know exists, like God, could have created this world in just 7 days. His companion patiently explained everything that the Bible says, but my father kept joking about the topic for a long time. He only had a few stops left on his route to finish, and at one of them he got out to pick up the trash. He didn't expect to encounter that thing. He said that at the back of the truck a very tall man was sitting. He was all darkness, a shadow with white eyes. When he saw my father, he began to laugh with a chilling cackle. My father was paralyzed with fear. He turned his head toward his companion and noticed he was praying. He looked back at that thing and it was gone, completely disappeared. His companion got out of the truck and said, "This is the power of God. Whenever you're in danger, don't hesitate to ask him for help. He is always listening to your prayers." Sometimes people throw valuable things in the trash. It's common to find electronic devices that still work or clothes and shoes in good condition. So, it's not unusual for collectors to check if something seems interesting and, if it works, to keep it. About 6 months ago, in a rather shady part of downtown, I found several quite heavy cardboard boxes. I thought they might have something interesting, so I opened one. What I found surprised and scared me. Jars with thick, dark liquid, red ribbons, blood-stained women's underwear, black feathers, and many razor blades. All of it was mixed together and smelled awful. Out of curiosity, I opened the second box, and it was filled with black-painted chicken beaks and feet. I noticed that the bottom of the third box was wet, and a thick brownish-red liquid similar to what was in the jars from the first box was seeping out. So, I didn't want to open that last box. It disgusted and gave me chills. The house where those boxes were thrown was very old and dirty. My coworkers said that a woman who practiced black magic lived there, and that they had found weird things in her trash several times before. This happened in the winter of 2018. During that time, I was assigned a new route that took us to slightly more dangerous parts of the city. Fortunately, these areas are also where people often throw away useful items. During my second week, we came across a bag containing various such objects, some stuffed animals, toys, and among all that I found a wooden cross. I picked it up and upon turning it, noticed it was covered in inscriptions made with a sharp object. At first they seemed meaningless, but when I looked closer I realized they appeared to form words in a language I had never seen before. Being quite skeptical, I wasn't scared at all. I just chuckled, put the cross back in the bag, and we threw it into the truck. What I didn't know at that moment was that this would mark the beginning of a series of strange events in my life. Just a couple of days later, my dog died suddenly. The vet never knew what had happened. He simply went to sleep one night and didn't wake up. After that, I started hearing noises around my apartment that made no sense. Footsteps, giggles, even whispers, mostly at night. I live alone, and my apartment is on the top floor, so hearing hurried footsteps on the roof at 2 a.m. was definitely not normal. I also began to notice my energy decreasing with each passing night. When I woke up, I felt pain all over my body and extreme fatigue, no matter how many hours I had slept. This went on for several weeks. My condition kept worsening while the strange noises continued to appear sporadically. At this point, I didn't know what to think. Although I understood that something strange was happening, I couldn't identify what could have caused it until one night when I remembered the wooden cross. I then called my sister, who came to visit me. When I told her everything that was happening, she asked her church's priest to visit and bless my home. The priest brought holy water and sprinkled it everywhere while praying, assuring me that it would help drive away any evil that was haunting me. That night, my sister stayed over to make sure I was going to be okay. I let her sleep in my room while I took the sofa in the living room. As I slept, I began to have a nightmare. In it, I was in my apartment, feeling like something was chasing me. I could never clearly see what it was, but it seemed to be surrounded by darkness. Unfortunately, when I tried to leave, I couldn't, so I had to find places to hide while that thing kept following me. Finally, while I was hiding under my bed, the creature found me and started dragging me toward the front door, which burst open, revealing a kind of black hole emanating a horrible smell and accompanied by a series of agonizing screams that chilled my skin. Just as I was about to be pulled into that strange portal, my sister woke me up. She said I had been screaming in my sleep, and I feel that, in some way, she saved me from whatever was happening to me in the dream. That was the last time anything strange happened to me, at least so far. I worked as a garbage collector for about 2 years. However, I decided to leave that job after a rather terrifying experience that happened to me not long ago. Although it wasn't paranormal, it was extremely disturbing and above all dangerous. Since I started that job, I had the same route. But one day they decided to change it, assigning me to collect trash from the parks and green areas of a different part of the city. At first, I didn't like the idea because I was so accustomed to my previous route. However, after 2 weeks of collection, I started to enjoy it because the amount of trash was significantly less and much cleaner. Everything began to change when, during one of my rounds, I found a small pink stuffed rabbit lying next to a trash can. I picked it up and checked its condition, which was surprisingly very good. So I decided to take it home, clean it thoroughly, and give it to my little daughter. She was thrilled when I gave it to her and spent the whole day playing with it until she took it to her room at night to sleep with it. At that point, nothing unusual was happening. However, the next morning, my daughter told me that she didn't want the toy anymore because it had given her nightmares during the night. In these nightmares, the toy spoke to her in an adult man's voice. I tried to convince her that it was just her imagination, but I still agreed to keep the toy in my room to make sure nothing strange happened again. The whole day passed in total tranquility, but when night came and I went to my room, I saw in the darkness that the belly of the little rabbit seemed to glow faintly with a red light. That didn't seem normal to me, so I decided to open it to see what was inside. Unfortunately, I got a very unpleasant and terrifying surprise when I found that the toy had a small camera and speaker inside it, both turned on. At that moment, I destroyed the device and tore the stuffed animal to pieces, then burned it. I have no idea what kind of disturbed person could have done something like that, but it was not a risk I wanted to take again. So, I decided to change jobs to avoid coming across more strange objects or instruments used by any number of perverts. This happened in the late 90s during my youth. One of the many jobs I had was being a garbage collector. Although it may be considered a bad job, the truth is it wasn't very difficult, and one quickly gets used to the smells emanating from people's waste. Over time, you even develop a certain immunity to it. The pay wasn't bad either, and I was going through a tough time in my life, so I couldn't be too demanding. During my first month, we followed the route that our truck had to take so thoroughly that I became very familiar with all the places we passed by. Among them was one that stood out in a very strange way. It was an old house in such a poor state that the word deplorable would be a compliment. Every time we passed by, we found among all the trash a large bag full of what seemed to be rag dolls. They were handmade and stitched with children's clothing. While this fact alone was at least curious, what one of my colleagues told me later made it much more disturbing. The person responsible for this wasn't someone who did crafts for a hobby, nor was it an old lady trying to pass the time. No, in that house lived only a man. Up to that point, I hadn't seen him in person, but he was described to me as very overweight, around 40 years old, and always looking very disheveled. According to some neighbors who informed my colleagues, the man had no family visiting him, didn't seem to have a partner, and certainly no children. Yes, it was strange, but that alone wasn't enough to accuse him of anything more than having questionable hobbies, at least not until a couple of months later. In one of the many bags he left outside the house, I noticed something unusual. The dolls, or rather the fabric they were made of, had stains all over them in a reddish, almost orange color. The authorities were contacted immediately, but by this point the man had already abandoned the place. To this day, that house remains abandoned, and the authorities apparently found no trace of the man. We never found out what those mysterious stains were or where they came from. Hello, I am a rear-loading garbage truck driver, and my shift is at night. It starts at 8 p.m. and usually ends around 3 or 4 in the morning. What I'm about to tell happened a couple of years ago during the summer. That night, my colleagues approached me asking for help and authorization to load a bunch of dirt into the truck. We aren't allowed to load rubble, but we knew that the woman had intended to pay well for it, so I reluctantly agreed. We took the enormous bags of trash the woman had already prepared and began loading them one by one. When I suddenly felt something very strange in one of the bags, like a substance that seemed like butter or a type of clay, it was very odd, but I tried to ignore it. When we finished, the woman gave us a very generous tip, which actually made me feel a bit bad because I felt we were doing something really improper. Finally, we left and continued with the route. As we were about to finish, we started noticing a smell that was becoming more and more intense. We are used to strong odors since we frequently go to the state dump, and it's something we know how to handle. But this smell was different. When we unloaded the truck, I noticed the woman's bags, which I could identify thanks to a distinctive red ribbon she had used to tie them. I approached one of them and, out of curiosity, opened it, finding inside a kind of very strange meat or fat. I've seen a lot of rotten meat thanks to my job, and while I don't know exactly what that thing was, I'm sure it wasn't from any common animal. In fact, I would dare to say it might have been human flesh. The truth is, it disgusted and scared me so much that I simply decided to close the bag again and pretend nothing had happened. But the strangest thing is that when we had to go through that area again, we noticed that the woman's house was now completely sealed with metal sheets and looked abandoned. After this, some colleagues said they felt strange when they started using that truck. They claimed to have seen or felt the presence of something evil, and also heard banging on the roof or doors while working at night. Upon checking, there was no one there. Whenever I can, I ask to be assigned to another truck, but we almost always end up using the same one. We've even sprayed it with holy water, but it seems that nothing works. We have amulets and other things inside that simply haven't had any effect. Whatever it was that we loaded onto the truck that night, it was something evil. I really regret making that deal with that strange woman. For many years, I've worked the same route. I know the houses, the streets, and the people very well. I know what they eat, what they buy online, and the kind of lives they lead in general. It's surprising how much you can learn about a person just from the things they throw away. But among all the strange things I've seen in this job, this is undoubtedly the worst of all. There was a family, a very strange family. I only remember seeing the father and one of the children a couple of times, although, from what I know, 5 people lived in that house. Their trash was pretty normal like that of the other neighbors, except that every now and then, You could perceive a terrible smell of death coming from the bottom of the bags. Usually, you don't open the trash bags, you just throw them into the truck and the compactor takes care of the rest. But on one occasion, due to the weight of the trash, one of the bags ripped open, spilling garbage all over the sidewalk. The terrifying part was seeing at least 7 perfectly severed cat heads fall out. They had been stripped of their eyes and ears, but still had fur. I held back the urge to vomit and quickly picked everything up. But that wasn't the only time I found dead animal remains in their trash. I don't know if they ate them or killed them for some other reason. That family moved away a while ago, and I have no idea where they are now. But I will never forget that horrific image. I arrived in the United States a little over 15 years ago, and like many Latinos, I have had a wide variety of jobs. I've washed dishes, landscaped gardens, delivered food, painted houses, and so on. But the only time something strange happened to me, something I can say with total certainty was paranormal, was in my current job as a garbage collector. This happened a little over 2 years ago when the COVID-19 pandemic lockdown was just beginning. I remember very well that it was a Friday evening. The sunlight was starting to fade, and the moon was already peeking out a bit in the sky. However, the heat was still lingering, as it always does here in southern Texas. My team and I were about to pick up the last trash can of the day, just as one of my co-workers threw the trash from the container into the truck, while another pressed the button to activate the compactor. A terrifying sound caught our attention. It was the screams of a person in agony, heard very loudly. We immediately stopped the truck's process and first started looking around to see if anyone was in danger, but there was no one outside. The screams were coming from inside our unit. Instantly, we began pulling out all the garbage we had already collected, intending to rescue whoever was in there. We spoke to the person, trying to ensure they were still in good condition and guide us to the exact spot where they were. We asked for their name, asked them to say something, anything, but we only received more and more heart-wrenching screams from the pile of waste. Within minutes, the neighbors were outside their houses, alarmed by the commotion. Some tried to help by looking for the unfortunate person, but no one could find anything. Shortly after, the authorities arrived, alerted by my co-workers. However, they too confirmed that there was no one in the truck. By this point, the screams had ceased, leading them to question us harshly, suspecting it might have been a tasteless prank. Nonetheless, the neighbors' testimonies helped prevent our arrest since they had also heard everything. Still, when we brought the truck back to our work center, we removed all the garbage again to ensure no one was inside. Indeed, there was no one. We never found out what happened that evening, but from that day on, strange things began to happen with that specific truck. It turns on and off by itself, both the engine and the compactor. During the nights, someone can be seen inside, and the screams have also returned. It has been so frequent that, as a joke, my co-workers have nicknamed the truck the Haunted Truck. Some people treat it as a joke, but my co-workers and I will never forget that afternoon and the strange, heart-wrenching and eerie screams that came from inside the container. My dad worked for many years as a garbage collector. The number of stories he has about that job is impressive, but there is one among all of them that stands out, and I will never forget it. In fact, it's the only time he ever talked about it because it brings back many memories that I'm sure he wants to keep out of his mind. On that occasion, his shift had already ended, and the truck they were working with had been having many issues throughout that week. Since the reports my dad submitted weren't being addressed, he decided to stay and wait for his supervisor. He approached the office and noticed the door was open. He peeked inside but didn't see anyone, so he decided to wait outside. A few minutes later, his boss arrived, and they both went inside. My father then noticed something on the floor under one corner of the desk. At first, he thought about picking it up and handing it to his supervisor, but he realized that his boss's behavior was somewhat strange. He seemed nervous, hurried, and occasionally stuttered a bit, something my dad had never seen in all his years working there. His boss was always a serious, confident man who projected very positive energy. Because of this, my father decided to move the object with his foot, sliding it closer to his chair. As discreetly as possible, he took a closer look at it. It was a photograph, specifically a photograph of a young girl. Nothing unusual, except that my father recognized her immediately. The woman was neither a family member nor an acquaintance of his boss. In fact, she was the daughter of one of my father's colleagues who had disappeared a short time before. Finally, feeling nervous, my dad ended the uncomfortable conversation and left the office. After walking a few steps, he silently returned and peeked through the edge of the office window. His boss was frantically searching for the photograph. When he found it, he took it and put it in a drawer that he locked. That night, my parents talked for hours about what they should do, because it wasn't solid evidence, but it couldn't be a simple coincidence either. Something shady was definitely going on. The problem was that the supervisor was a relative of the city governor at the time, a governor well known for his connections with organized crime. There were already many rumors surrounding him, as anyone who questioned him would mysteriously disappear. In the end, my parents decided to keep quiet. Shortly after, my dad resigned from that job and started working with one of my uncles in his mechanic shop. He says he lost a good job with a steady salary, benefits, and considerable seniority. But the safety of our family was more important. But he gained some emotional peace by not having to see that horrible man's face every day. The worst part of all this is that they never found the girl in that photo. The videos about garbage collectors have caught my attention because a few years ago, when my job situation was very complicated, I found myself having to search through trash to find items I could sell. Here in Spain, there's a store called Retro Vintage that buys and sells secondhand items, something that's very trendy. So I saw an opportunity in the trash. One morning, while dropping my daughter off at school, I found a trash container, and next to it was a dark wooden doll that seemed to be of African origin. It had a horrid face, looking like an aged, angry wild man. Its body was exposed except for a loincloth made of a vegetable fiber resembling hemp. When I returned from dropping off my daughter, I went to get the doll, thinking I could sell it for a good amount of money. I found it, took it, and noticed it was broken, so I brought it home to try to repair it. That's when strange things started to happen. As soon as I crossed the threshold of my house, I heard a voice in my head that sounded like a man, threatening me, saying he wanted to be the master of my home. In my mind, I simply responded, no. Although this was strange, I didn't give it much thought. When I began the repairs, one of the doll's pieces suddenly jumped toward my abdomen, and 2 nails stuck into my skin. After finishing the repairs, I dressed the doll and planned to do a more extensive restoration to sell it for a higher price. I left it in a room I used for storage, but when I turned off the light, I noticed that its darkness was such that it seemed to have disappeared. It's worth noting that even in the dark, the rest of the items were still visible, but not the doll. It was as if a dark shroud covered it all the time. That same night, when I went to sleep, I had nightmares about that figure, seeing it move as if it were alive. The nightmares made me wake up, and when I did, I could see the shadow of that thing projected all over my room. In the following days, more strange things happened, even during the day. Finally, a week after finding it, I was able to sell it. Now it's very clear to me why the previous owners had broken it and thrown it away. However, every time I pass by the place where that container is, I wonder what other strange things might be hidden in that trash. It's something I won't know, because I left that job a while ago and don't plan to investigate further. Thank you very much for listening to me. This happened many years ago, supposedly back in the 1920s, and it's a sort of legend in my family. It turns out my great-grandfather collected garbage, but not in the way it's done now. He had a horse and a wooden cart, with which he went around houses and roads, picking up garbage in exchange for some coins. Sometimes he found good or valuable things that people discarded. As far as I know, many people in Mexico still do this to make a living. Anyway, they say he was already on his way home along a dirt road in the middle of the countryside. It was getting dark, and his horse was tired, so it was moving slowly. Suddenly, something started to glow among the bushes. It looked like someone had made a campfire. At first, my great-grandfather didn't pay much attention to it, but then he noticed that the flame began to change colors, from blue to green, then to bright red at times. This, of course, caught his attention, So he decided to stop, get off his cart, and go see what it was. He walked into the woods, and the closer he got, he noticed that the flame was actually floating in the air and getting smaller and smaller, as if it was gradually extinguishing as he approached. When he reached the exact spot where the flame was, it disappeared completely, and my great-grandfather found himself in front of a large, dark brown sack. Opening it, he was met with a great surprise. The sack was full of gold coins. Unable to believe his luck, my great-grandfather slung the sack over his shoulder and quickly loaded it onto his cart, covering it with branches and other trash to avoid anyone else seeing it. He arrived home very happy, and called my great-grandmother and their children to share the good news and show them the treasure he had found. However, when he gathered everyone and opened the sack, it no longer contained gold coins, but something horrifically macabre. Inside were the dismembered remains of a small child. My great-grandmother almost fainted, and my great-grandfather was pale and terrified. Despite knowing he could get into serious trouble, he did the right thing and went to find the head of the local police. He had to spend a few nights in jail until it was clarified that he had nothing to do with the child's death. However, the child was never identified due to the primitive state of investigations at that time, especially in such a remote area. The person responsible for such a horrible act was never found either. Over the years, my great-grandfather came to believe that the child's spirit had deceived him into bringing him to town so he could be buried and finally rest in peace, something that ultimately happened. I work covering routes in the garbage collection service in Mexico City, the capital of my country. My job essentially involves substituting for coworkers who, for various reasons, cannot attend their job. This has led me to cover most of the routes, and therefore most of the city. I've seen many containers, found many things, and had a couple of paranormal experiences that can be quite terrifying. However, there is one experience in particular that has remained chilling and quite difficult to explain since it happened to me. It happened around the year 2000. At that time, I was covering for a colleague who had the route that passed through the Benito Juarez district, where I had already been working for a full week without any issues. One morning, everything was going as usual, like any other day. I remember we had already covered some streets when we reached an alleyway that divided two buildings. There were several containers shared by the residents, so there was always a considerable amount of trash. We parked and began carrying all the bags to the truck until something caught my attention. Next to the large metal container was a smaller blue plastic one with a black bag that emitted a strong odor and was tied with a red cord. I didn't think much of it and picked up the container to toss it into the truck along with the bag. However, as I was carrying it, I suddenly felt someone grab my arm forcefully. Looking up over the trash, I saw an elderly woman dressed in tattered, very dirty and torn clothes. She was screaming, "That's mine!" repeatedly, while holding onto my arm so tightly that at some point, I began to feel a burning sensation where she was grabbing me. I was paralyzed for a few minutes because the sight of the woman screaming while burning my skin was extremely disturbing. When I could finally react, all I did was let the plastic container drop so she could take it with her. At that moment, she took what was hers and began dragging it back into the alley. My co-workers came running to see what was happening since I was taking too long. I told them about the woman, and we all went to look for her, but we found no trace of her except for the mark and the pain she left on my wrist as if she had burned my skin. When I asked my co-workers if they hadn't heard the screams, they said no, they hadn't heard anyone else with me. I tried to keep going, but my arm hurt so much that I had to leave mid-shift to get it checked out. It turned out to be a second-degree burn, which put me on leave for a full 2 weeks. I've returned to work in that area, but fortunately, I've never encountered that strange old woman again. Although the mark on my arm has faded significantly, it's still visible today, and I believe it will never completely disappear. I don't know if it counts as human behavior, but I had a strange experience with my little dog. It has happened several times, but none were like the first time. She is a boxer, but she's always been a bit smaller for her breed. She was the smallest of her litter and had only been at the house for a short time, less than a week. She's always been super curious, and especially when she was little, she would get into everything and smell everything she could in the house. At that time, Probably because she was in a new home, she was a bit more skittish and cautious. We were trying to train her, mainly to go to the bathroom outside in the yard. We were particularly worried about her peeing inside the house while we were asleep. So my siblings and I took turns staying outside with her until she did her business before we went to bed. That night it was my turn. I closed the door to the house and waited for her to do what she needed to do. But as usual, she first got distracted by the plants and some other things in the yard. She was playful and jumping around when, suddenly, she stopped completely still, staring directly outside through the gate. All my neighbors had already turned off their lights, so the only light came from a small one behind me. Then she turned and looked directly at me. She was standing right on the edge where the light didn't reach, in the shadows. From the distance, I couldn't see the white parts of her eyes, and they looked completely black. At that moment, I don't know why, but I got goosebumps all over my body. There was no noise, and she was as still as a statue. I tried calling her by name, but she didn't move a muscle. She stayed like that for a good 2 minutes. Even though she was so small at the time, she felt very imposing, and even dangerous. She didn't growl or bare her teeth, but she stood there staring at me with those completely black eyes. Then, as if nothing had happened, she started moving normally again, came up to me as usual, and everything was normal from then on. It took me several minutes to calm my nerves and several days to interact with her normally again. Since then, I've seen her like that again, in the darkness of the rooms, staring at me directly with her black eyes. I've decided to believe she does it to check if we are okay, but the anxiety of feeling that way again is a thorn that, even 7 years later, is still present inside me. Dogs always behave strangely around me, but only at certain times of the day, like during mirror hours or after 7 p.m. I try not to go outside at those times since my presence seems to threaten them in some way. At least that's the feeling I get. They bark at me all the time, but when they don't, sometimes they just stay still, staring at me. Some people don't believe me, but I've seen how they stand on 2 legs while watching me with a threatening look. This makes me very uncomfortable because it feels like a human being is watching me from a blind spot. And in case you're wondering, no, they aren't leaning on anything. They just stand on 2 legs. When this happens, I get the most nervous. If they start barking, their owners usually come out to calm them down and see what's going on, only to find that it's just me walking by. But when they're standing there observing me, well, that's a very creepy feeling. It's like being stalked by a person. It's a terrible experience that I wouldn't wish on anyone. It's very strange that this only happens with dogs and no other animals. It's curious because they never attack me or even try to. They just bark at me from a distance or stand on 2 legs and watch me until I walk away far enough for them to forget and return to normal. And obviously, I have no idea why this happens. It's just something very strange that I hope will finally stop one day. I had a bad experience thanks to my cat, Gustavito. We had an elderly neighbor who always stood on his terrace to look at the horizon, and from there he could also see our terrace and yard because his house was 1 floor higher. The neighbor always said, "How annoying is your gray kitty?" because my Gustav always entered his house to steal bread. The neighbor never mistreated my cat, but he didn't have any fondness for him either. One day the neighbor passed away. A few days went by, the wake, the burial, and little by little, everything returned to normal. Until one morning, I went up to see my cat as usual. He was sitting there, and when I approached, he turned to look at me and came closer. But in the middle of his walk, he stopped as if there was an invisible wall in front of him and started growling in a horrible way, something he had never done before and hasn't done since. I then realized that the cat wasn't growling at me. He was staring fixedly above me, towards the neighbor's terrace. I didn't know what to do. I was petrified and didn't have the courage to turn around. I just kept saying, "Gustavito, it's me. Look at me." But the cat remained in that state, and it felt like an eternity to me. At some point, I gathered the courage and picked up the cat. Gustav was trembling and growling uncontrollably in my arms. That's when I turned towards my neighbor's house, and there was absolutely nothing there. I was so scared that I ran inside with Gustav to his little room on the terrace. Some of my family members came up, worried because I hadn't come down, and found both the cat and me trembling. I told them what happened, and for my peace of mind, someone said that surely the neighbor's ghost had come to say goodbye to his house, and Gustav had seen him. Just remembering this still gives me chills. A few months ago, a dog appeared at our house. We soon found out that it belonged to our neighbors, but they didn't treat it well. They always let it roam the streets and didn't feed it. It was honestly a mess. So, after I begged my parents, we finally adopted it. However, over time, I started noticing some rather strange, if not disturbing, behaviors in him. I remember one time I was in my room, sleeping peacefully since no one else was home. I don't know how much time passed, but suddenly I woke up to the sound of the television. I thought my mom had come home because I started hearing laughter, so I went to greet her, but I got a horrible surprise when I noticed that the only one there was my dog, sitting on a chair like a person with an open magazine in front of him. I felt an enormous fear and quickly decided to lock myself in my room. About half an hour passed, and then my mom came home. I heard the television turn off and something like a book or a magazine being thrown against the glass table. Besides this, the dog also does other strange things, like staring at us in a very odd way while we're sleeping or in the bathroom. I also remember something that happened once when my mom and I were watching TV. At that time, he was used to sleeping in my parents' room where we were. I was already half asleep, but my mom was awake. She suddenly started shaking me and said, Look at what the dog is doing." When I turned, I saw that he was bringing his bed, which was a pretty heavy mattress, along with his blanket. This wasn't strange by itself, but then he started making his bed in a very peculiar way and then lay down to sleep. I swear, my mom and I were both quite puzzled and a bit scared, to be honest. In addition to all this, more things have happened. However, although this dog sometimes scares me a little, in general, he is a very good pet, and we love him a lot. If you're enjoying this video, don't forget to leave a like. We upload 3 videos a week, so subscribe and activate the bell to become a member of this creepy world. My sister told me an anecdote that her ex-father-in-law shared with her. It happened in Veracruz. The man had a cat with gray and black spots on its face and a notched ear. He named it Solo Vino because one day, it just appeared in front of his house, and they decided to adopt it. Everything seemed to be going well until they noticed the cat exhibiting strange, almost human behavior. Sometimes they would hear it laughing, and other times it would call the man's wife Mama. One night, the man was having a cup of coffee while lying in his hammock. The cat, having finished eating, stood on 2 legs and stared at him, saying, "Well, I'm off now." The man jumped up in fright and yelled, "I'll shoot you if you don't leave." He ran into the house and told his wife what had happened. They both started praying and never saw that cat again. My grandmother, rest in peace, worked cleaning the house of a man. They both lived in a rural area. Every day she had to walk 4 kilometers to and from work, so she had to leave very early to be back in time to have lunch ready at home by noon. This meant she would leave at 5 in the morning to work. What I'm about to tell happened in the winter, when the nights are longer. That morning, she left her house with an hour and 20 minutes of travel ahead of her. Luckily, that particular night, the moon was lighting the way. At a certain point in her journey, there was a stream, and when she was a few meters away from it, my grandmother began to feel something strange, a dense presence. She felt scared but decided to ignore it and just continued on her way. However, she soon felt the presence more strongly and realized it was a black dog, a presence that was not good at all. So, she only glanced at it from the corner of her eye while quickening her pace. The dog then started walking alongside her. Suddenly, my grandmother noticed that the animal stood up and started walking on 2 legs, very quickly but clumsily, step by step like a human. At that precise moment, she felt immense fear and began to pray the Our Father, the only prayer she knew at the time. She finally reached the stream, and when she crossed it, the dog simply stayed behind. She didn't want to turn around but felt it was still watching her for a while longer. So she just crossed herself and thanked God for his help. Since then, she started using the horse to go to work, even though it wasn't very tame, and she only left the house when the sun was about to rise. Thank you very much for reading my story. I send you a big greeting. What I am going to tell you is recent. I doubt many will believe me. I wouldn't believe it either. In fact, I haven't told anyone for fear they'd think I'm crazy. But it's completely real. It began in May when my nephew adopted a stray cat. However, since his dog had puppies that were still newborn, he asked if the cat could stay here in the store. It only took one night for it to adapt to its new home. My mom and I weren't too happy about it since it left fur everywhere. But we had no choice because my sister is currently pregnant, and we couldn't have the cat upstairs. Everything had been going well for a while. However, everything changed one day when I came back after getting some tacos. The cat got excited, thinking I was going to feed it, and came up to me begging for food, but I didn't give it any. When I went to the bakery next to the business where I work to add some sauce to my tacos, I heard a voice which I thought was from a customer. When I came back, I didn't see anyone. But when I turned around, the cat was there, standing on two legs trying to reach the tacos I had left on the table. When it realized I was watching, it went back to acting like a normal cat. I thought I had imagined it or something. But later that same day, when I was closing the store, I noticed the cat was looking at me with a hateful, angry expression. It didn't seem like the look of a cat. It looked more like a human stare. When my two nephews came downstairs, the cat stopped looking at me and acted as if nothing had happened. Since then, every time we are alone, the cat gives me that same look. Sometimes when I come downstairs, I see it walking on two legs, and I've even heard it speak. The curious thing is that I'm not the only one who has seen it. Once, a customer, after returning from the bathroom, told me he saw the cat walking on two legs and coming straight towards him. This scared him so much that he decided to leave. To this day, that cat is still here. When I eat or do something, it follows me with its eyes in a very strange way. We've thought about giving it away, but whenever we talk about it, the cat disappears for a few days and then comes back. I don't know what to do anymore. I feel watched, and the more I look into its eyes, the less they seem like a cat's eyes.